Before we dive into the hottest news topics, if you love Flash Drive, make sure you're following us on Spotify and Apple to know as soon as any new content drops.
I believed it was necessary to have authority to have what were effectively emergency powers to exercise in extreme situations that would be unforeseen, that would enable me to act in the national interest.
Between March 2020 and May 2021, Scott Morrison was appointed to 5 additional portfolios.
He needs to resign and he needs to leave Parliament.
The Liberals are supposed to be the party of freedom, but look now. Under Scott Morrison, it looks like they were the party just hungry for power.
There has been sustained backlash and criticism across politics for former PM Scott Morrison, who swore himself into several ministries, unbeknownst to most of his colleagues. He says it was a way to safeguard those ministries for precautionary, prudent and responsible reasons. We chat to the journo at the forefront of this story about what the heck happened, what the heck it all means, and what in the heck it could lead to.
Plus, this may be the most politically explosive raid ever undertaken by the FBI.
Remember that FBI raid on Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago residence in Florida? We'll dive into its significance and whether it has any effect on his presidential chances.
And get ready to feel old or young. It's a very special milestone for the compact disc. If any of our flash drivers are Zoomers, we will explain what a compact disc is and how it changed the world. I'm Georgie Tunny.
And I'm James Law.
And this is Flash Drive. J.Law, what a damn week.
I know, and there's some bad news for everyone, right, to kick off with.
Oh, I know.
What do you got for us? What do you got for us?
More rain.
Ugh, bearer of bad news.
When does it end? Once again, the Bureau has warned the eastern coast of Australia that there is likely 70% chance of La Nina forming again for this summer.
No.
It's already been the wettest Sydney on record, like the wettest season year that it's ever had, and we're only in August.
Right.
Like there's still millions of months left in this year, so that's unfortunate.
And I feel like I barely had a summer last summer because in Sydney it was so wet and just miserable, and I'm over it.
I know, I'm so over it. And
who do we speak to?
Oh, well, I do actually have an in with one of Australia's favourite meteorologists, Nathan Byrne, who works for the ABC. And every time the weather is less than okay and pretty mediocre, I give him a call and I say, Nathan, what are you doing?
Yeah.
And he reminds me, Georgina, I do not control the weather. And I just don't think that's true. I don't think it's true.
Yeah.
Oh, but isn't that just disastrous? I feel like that's not a great way for us to start the podcast, Flash Drivers. However, we got to bring you the news, all of the news, not just the news that we like. There's been one major story that's dominated the Australian news agenda since the weekend, revelations that Scott Morrison secretly appointed himself to 5 ministries. News.com.au's national political editor Samantha Maiden broke the story. She joins us. Sam, welcome to Flash Drive.
Thank you. I do have to credit, though, my colleagues at the Weekend Australian, Simon Benson and Jeff Chambers, because they had a book that came out called Plagued, which actually kicked off the idea that the Prime Minister had signed himself into the health portfolio with the knowledge and consent of Greg Hunt. What they didn't know, and I didn't know on the weekend either, I didn't know until Monday, was that he also managed to take the finance portfolio, didn't tell Matthias Cormann. But the story that I broke that kicked things off was basically about the Resources Minister, Keith Pitt, and the fact that he didn't know until he was meant to make this big gas project decision that Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, Scott Morrison was hanging out in his portfolio and could pounce when he wanted to.
Now, Sam, perhaps you could put it in context. This is really unusual, right?
Well, yes and no. I mean, it's not unusual, for example, if you have a minister that gets unwell or goes on leave, or it's paternity leave, or, you know, we had a couple of ministers go on mental health leave last year for various scandals. It's not unusual for the government or the Prime Minister to go to the Governor-General and say, oh, you know, Stuart Robert is going to be looking after education while Alan Tudge is on leave, for example, right? And then he'll go, yeah, we'll just sign an administrative order. And it's basically just so they can sign the books and things can tick over. What's weird about this one is they've kind of used that mechanism in a way that hasn't been used before. First of all, to not tell the public. You know, usually there's like something that's put out on the government gazette, or they make an announcement in Parliament like it's public. But the really wild aspect to this is the idea that he was going to the Governor-General and asking to be signed on to portfolios where the Minister didn't know about it, right? Like, that's the part that is really, like, blowing people's faces off. And so if I could just go through the timeline, like, really quickly, basically in March of 2020, I think it's March the 15th, Greg Hunt, he basically says to Greg Hunt, I'm a bit worried about this biodiversity. You can call in the army, you can do all this crazy stuff. Maybe as a bit of a check and balance, you should sign me into the portfolio so there's two hands, and if you get sick and you get put on a ventilator or something, you know, that's our plan B. And Greg Hunt basically goes, yeah, no worries, I've got no problem with that. Where it starts to get a little more wild is 14 days later, Scott Morrison clearly goes, I wouldn't mind having a bit of finance portfolio as well. So he signs himself on March the 30th to Matthias Cormann's portfolio and never tells him and never takes it off. So that means that even when Matthias Cormann left and Simon Birmingham was the minister, he's got like this potential power. Now, the Prime Minister's argument is, I never used those powers, but I needed them in an emergency reserve. But he hasn't, I think, provided a really logical explanation of why he didn't tell the ministers. So the first two people, I mean, I've sort of said it's a bit like, you know, when you watch NYPD Blue and they're chasing a serial killer, and then at some point during the movie they go, he's killing people faster, we need to find out, right? And so it's kind of like, you know, the space between his kills is shortening, right? And there seems to be a bit of that, right, with Scott Morrison, because he basically, you know, he does Greg Hunt, and Greg Hunt's like, yeah, no worries. And then he's like, I might take finance, right? Doesn't tell Matthias. And then he spends a whole year, like, controlling himself, right? And then in April of 2021, like a full year later, he goes, and then, like, basically goes, I'm going to take now industry, right? And the interesting thing about that is that this is like a poacher-turned-gamekeeper situation, because Christian Porter is a former Attorney General, and Christian Porter has taught him how to do it in March of 2020. He's like, how do I do this? And he's like, well, you just go to the Governor General, you can do this, and you can do that if you want, I won't tell anyone. So then the minute he's taken out of Attorney Generals and put into an industry, the Prime Minister basically puts on the balaclava and runs down to the Governor General's office and goes, I'd like some of his industry portfolio, please. And so then he's signed on to the industry portfolio. He doesn't do anything. He doesn't use those powers at all until December of 2021, like 9 months or something like that later, when Keith Pitt is trying to decide this gas project. And he basically says to Keith Pitt, well, there's a couple of options, you know, like you could just block it like I want you to, or if you don't want to do that, I can block it myself. And Keith Pitt basically is really cross. He says, I want to see the executive order. Like, where's the paperwork for this? And told that there isn't an executive order, that it's not public. Then he goes to the Nationals leader and says, this is not okay. And he's basically told, well, he's the Prime Minister, he can do that, right? But then that's back in December 2021. The bit that I missed was that, so he signs on to industry in April of 2021. And then in May of 2021, he goes, that's when he like completely loses it. And he takes Home Affairs, right, Karen Andrews' portfolio, and he takes Treasury, right? Now, the interesting thing about that is he obviously had, and this didn't get explained in the press conference. It's so frustrating because, like, we'll never get another chance to ask him again. But he clearly had some sort of, like, survival instinct for a whole year when Peter Dutton is in Home Affairs. He obviously thought, well, if I do that to Peter Dutton is going to kill me with his bare hands, right? And so he didn't do that. Like, he didn't do it when Dutton was in the portfolio. But the minute they put Karen Andrews in, he basically does it to her. Now, I don't know why he did it to her. I mean, there's some theories that, like, the week before he did it, she was going on radio saying that she might let the Bilo family out of detention for Christmas. Now, I don't know if that was a factor, but, like, I mean, some people think that it might be. And with the Treasury, there just seems to be no explanation for it all. And after he did that, like a couple of weeks after he, like, secretly took Josh Frydenberg's portfolio off him, he invited him to come live with him at the lodge. And so they were like sharing microwave dinners and stuff. And he never thought to tell him. Now, his argument today is like, you know, I didn't want them looking over their shoulders, right? But the bit that he's not admitting to, which I think is fairly obvious, is that he basically looked at the ministers that had powers that didn't have to be referred to cabinet. So he looked at ministers that had powers that, you know, the gas project decision is not a matter for cabinet. The minister is the decision maker. And he basically said, I don't want people that have powers that I don't have, I think. I don't want people who have powers that don't have to be referred to. So I'm going to put myself over the top of them. And basically, I think, sorry to be unkind because I think he's a massive control freak. And so basically he could then say, I'll just let them do their thing, like almost like a toddler, like I'll let them play in the garden, right? But if they do something that I don't like, and it's something that I can't control because it doesn't have to go to cabinet, the minister has that responsibility, I now have that responsibility as well. And I can overrule them, basically.
And Sam, we're speaking fresh off the back of what was, I think it's fair to say, a pretty extraordinary press conference from the former PM. Firstly, what did you make of it?
Well, I thought that it was he's either delusional or he's deceptive, right? And maybe a little bit of both, right? Because he started off the press conference with one of those unbearable monologues, right, about, you know, it's this Winston Churchill stuff, like we'll fight them on the beaches and unprecedented times and COVID and all the rest of it. And all of that is completely true. But it doesn't explain what he did in industry in April 2021. And even though COVID was ticking up in May of 2021, it doesn't explain why he did it to Treasury and Home Affairs, really. Like if you wanted the Home Affairs thing because you're worried about borders or something, then why didn't you do it before? Like it's illogical. It doesn't make sense. And partway during the press conference, like he was almost rebutting things that he'd said earlier in the press conference. Like he started off with that big riff about the pandemic, and then later in the press conference was saying, "I never said it was a pandemic. I didn't say that. I never said what you think." You know, like. And then the other thing that I thought was really interesting was the exchanges with the journalists. Like he had a number of testy exchanges with several journalists, but particularly Andrew Clennell from Sky, and like. He was really, like, I get the fact that Clennell is spiky and he asks spiky questions, as he should, but he was really personal, I thought, with Clennell. Like, he was kind of attacking him and saying... He
called him a bully, pretty much.
Yeah, he basically said, I'm not going to be bullied by you, which is kind of a bit interesting.
Rich.
It was interesting as well because he started the press conference saying... There's enough time. We're going to get to everyone.
Oh, and to
everyone,
be fair,
which
he
we
did.
know we've not seen.
He did.
He did, but it's not been his MO, right?
No.
No, but I mean, it was a long press conference. But like the other thing that I'm really fascinated by is how is it, right, that he did that interview with Ben Fordham on 2GB and he was asked, did you take any other portfolios? And he's paused and then he said, not to my recollection. Now, not to my recollection is kind of something you say to ICAC when you know but you don't want to say something. Then he's saying, oh, I forgot. How could you forget? Like, I mean, he did it a year ago. Like, so he's either lying to Ben Fordham or he actually has some sort of neurological problem, right? Like, I mean, he didn't play NRL. He hasn't been knocked around. So I tend to lean towards the idea that he did know and thought maybe he could still get away with it. But how could he think that? Like, he knows that the PMNC is going through all the paperwork. Like, I don't really get it. And the other thing that I would have liked to have heard in that press conference, which we didn't get to, is like, who else did he tell? Like, he seemed to at one point suggest that he didn't tell any ministers. So who did know in his office? Did his chief of staff, John Kunkel, know? Was it just the guy in his office that I hear was involved in all of those things? Was it like how many people knew, right? Clearly the industry department knew when the whole stuff went down with Keith Pitt, and by the sound of it, they were quite worried about it. And clearly the Department of PM&C knew. So maybe, I don't know, maybe Phil Gaetjens, the head of the Department of PM&C, knew. Did his chief of staff know? John Kunkel, we don't know. Did his political advisor, Euron Finkelstein, know? We don't know. And why were they allowed to know, but the ministers weren't allowed to know? I mean, his argument is, I didn't want them looking over my shoulders. But what did he say? And the other thing is he refused to answer the question, and he got really testy with Andrew Clennell during this about what the Governor-General said to him, whether the Governor-General asked him to disclose this or not. And at some point, you know, that'll have to be disclosed, surely, right?
Yeah. I'm interested as well as about the psychology of these actions, given it's Scott Morrison. Like, you obviously watched his Prime Minister closer than anyone. He's got a bit of form when it comes to secrecy, as you famously exposed with his Hawaii trip.
Yeah.
What is the psychology behind this move in your view? You know, Malcolm Turnbull in his book famously called him a control freak. Is that what it is? Is it control freakery?
Yeah, that's my instinct. Look, he's always been obsessed with secrecy, and I read about this during the week. Laurie Oakes, the legendary Channel 9 journalist, he wrote quite an influential column. It was about 10 years ago. I think it was in 2013. And it was basically about Scott Morrison's conduct during those early press conferences in Operation Sovereign Border. And he was really dismissive and rude and belligerent towards the media. He wouldn't tell the media things. He wouldn't let the media have any information about boat arrivals. And then if they got something wrong, he would roast them. But if they asked to fact check things, he was like, I'm not going to tell you anything, right? So, and Laurie Oakes basically wrote this column where he said, this guy, the power has gone to his head. You know, Tony Abbott needs to take him aside and have a talk to him. And, you know, what I wrote in the column this week was, you know, if Tony Abbott pulled him aside and had a talk to him, it didn't work, right? Because this has always been his instinct. And, you know, this is an absolute core part of his being. It's a complete pattern of behaviour, whether it is, you know, it starts with Operation Sovereign Borders. That's the most obvious thing, where he's withholding information when maybe he doesn't necessarily need to, because I think it just turns him on. There may be operational reasons in some circumstances where it's legitimate, but what he did went above and beyond that. Obviously, there's Hawaii. Once again, okay, he wanted to go on a holiday, you know, that's fine. But why not just tell people that he was going overseas? Because he didn't want them to know and he thought he could get away with it, and then he couldn't. The other example is obviously when he invited Brian Houston, the Hillsong founder, to the White House. Now, again, it's kind of like, who cares? Like, okay, he invited him to the White House, like, fine, you know. But he won't say whether he did or not, and then this thing rages for years and there's all these FOIs, and in the end he did, right? Like what, you know? And it just goes on and on and on. And there's so many examples of that. And this is the time where he actually did it to his whole cabinet, right? And I think what it comes back to is that he is a control freak, and he doesn't really have any relationships of trust, really, right? Like, he might think he does, but, you know, Josh Frydenberg, he presented as, you know, he called him brother in his concession speech on election night. And he said in the press conference today that they'd had this, I think he called it lovely, or he said, there was some word that he used that was like, we've had this beautiful conversation and we're still the best of friends. Now, once again, this goes to delusion or deception, because Josh Frydenberg is furious. And he's told all his friends he's furious. And he's told all his colleagues that I told Scott I wasn't happy in that conversation. So what conversation was Scott listening to, right? Does he not have any emotional intelligence? I mean, like, Josh Frydenberg's not a screamer, so I don't think Josh would have rung him up and said, you know, you expletive or whatever. But Josh is absolutely adamant that he made it completely obvious to the former Prime Minister that this was unacceptable, it was unnecessary, it never should have happened, that he offered him complete loyalty, that people came to him and told him to challenge, you know, in the dying years of the government, and he knocked them back. And he is absolutely furious. And he did, no doubt politely, but he did make that clear to the former Prime Minister yesterday, right? And then Scott Morrison gets up and says that they had a lovely conversation and they're still the best of friends. Well, that's a lie. Josh is really angry.
Given his tendency to want to control everything then, Scott Morrison, was there any part of you that thought when this first press release came out that we were going to have this press conference today that thought maybe he was going to resign, or were you firmly like, oh, he's not going out this way?
I did wonder if he was going to resign, but I kind of thought, I can't imagine him wanting to go out like that because he is a control freak. Like, I think he'll resign before the next election, but I just couldn't really imagine him giving people that, you know, like, sort of surprised in a sense that he did the press conference, really. I don't know why he did, really, because he'd gone on... I mean, I suppose you got to pay him credit for doing it, right? Because he'd gone on Ben Fordham and given this, you know, comical account where he'd said, I don't recall any other portfolios. So, you know, like, I think, you know, give the man props for facing the media and answering the questions. But... yeah, I did wonder for a second when I saw it, but equally, I didn't think that he'd want to go out like that.
Because it would be a concession that he did the wrong thing, which he's not really willing to do.
And he's apologising. He's given one of these apologies that, like, you know, AFL players give. It's like I apologise to anyone who was offended. Like, it's kind of like putting it on them. It's like, I don't think I did anything wrong, but like, if you're some like massive weirdo that's got a problem, like, sorry.
Sorry, I got caught.
Yeah.
I'm looking ahead. I mean, we're right in the middle of this story now, but what do you think this does to his reputation as a Prime Minister? Is this going to hang over him forever?
I think it completely trashes his reputation as Prime Minister. And I think that it is going to, because it's just, it goes to his character, right? It goes to his character and everything that everyone's always accused him of that he doesn't agree with, that he's, he's a control freak who's obsessed with secrecy. And, like, that is just an example of that, this writ large. And I think the other problem he's got is that, like, there's a whole bunch of people that I suppose have a shared mission in the legacy of the government. And, Josh Frydenberg is one of them. Like, he wants people, he's proud of what they did in terms of protecting Australia from the ravages of the virus. And I think there's, a strong argument that Australia did come out of it pretty good in the beginning. Like, obviously, there's a lot of COVID now everywhere now, but equally there is this argument that, we would have had even more deaths if we hadn't been vaccinated. And the whole purposes of all those initial lockdowns was to basically keep the virus out of Australia long enough to vaccinate. And I'm not suggesting for a minute that they didn't make mistakes of government. Of course they did. But, we didn't get hit by the ravages of the virus when we were unvaccinated. And there is, the economy has come back really well in a lot of quarters. Obviously, we're dealing with the fallout of the pandemic in terms of inflation and interest rates. I'm not denying that. But, employment is very high and all of those things. And so I think it's really dangerous for him, because I just think there's going to be a whole bunch of people that may have been a bit more circumspect that are now just going to be, spilling their guts to journalists and people writing books and stuff. Hopefully, anyway.
Good for you, Sam. Good for you.
And on that, Sam, like, just before we let you go, I wanted to get one of the key parts, I think, of the press conference for me, which stood out, was when he was on the defensive, Scott Morrison, and he said, well, you can't really understand that because you've never been the Prime Minister during a pandemic.
Yeah. I love that part of the press conference.
Yeah. What did you make of that? Like, how much stock do we put in that? Because it's like, well, I mean, true, but also, what?
Of course it's true, but also it's so diluted. And, like, because basically what he's saying is, you don't know how hard it's been for me because you're a journalist and you're a nothing. Right? Like, that's what he was basically saying. He was basically saying, you're just a little nobody, Andrew Clennell. Because it was to Clennell, right? Like, he basically said, he was like, well, you've never been Prime Minister during a pandemic in the greatest crisis since World War II, Andrew Clennell, right? And so, like, he's not just saying it to Andrew Clennell, right? He's saying it to all the journalists in the room. He's basically saying, you're losers, right? Like, that's what he's saying. And I just think it's like, what a weirdo. I mean, like, he there was one point where he said that thing about people holding me responsible for every drop of rain. And it's like, dude, no,
every strain of virus.
Like, get over yourself. Like, the whole country is not, like, looking to the skies and going, oh, it's raining. That's Scott Morrison. What are you talking about, right? What are you on? I mean, basically, like, I get it. He's like, one of his complaints, which is more a thing that conservatives say, is this idea that he should have, stopped the states from being so draconian or closing borders, whatever. And he makes the point that he couldn't stop them because they had the power to do that. And that's true. But this idea that, everyone holds me responsible for everything, well, suck it up, princess. That's what being the Prime Minister is. So, and you did get paid $500,000 a year or something to do it. Like, that's your job, right? Mm-hmm. So I thought it was really and look, I think that the impact of media intrusion on political families, I totally understand that. And I totally understand why you'd be upset at the idea of your kids coming and going from your house and getting photographed all the time. Like, I understand and respect that, right? But equally, there is something a little bit manipulative, like he started it with the, stop taking pictures of Jenny. And then he's ended it with, and stop taking pictures of Jenny. And it's like, okay, I do get it, but also, he was happy enough for the media to take pictures of Jenny when he thought it humanised him. There's been cameras out of the front of his house periodically since May, right? Like, And all of a sudden, like, he's got a legitimate gripe. I'm not saying he doesn't, but he's also using it for this sort of manipulative purpose. And whenever he gets into trouble, he always, drags Jenny on the scale. Like, remember when he did that 60 Minutes interview and he was saying, actually going to Hawaii was Jenny's idea.
Yeah. I literally just had April Son of Cuba just popped into my head.
Oh, God.
Once again.
There you go.
J.Law, any more questions for the delightful Samantha?
No, thank you so much for your insights.
Sam, thank you so much. It's been an absolutely massive week. And remember, Flash drivers, you can catch Sam pretty much every single day in all of the content that she pumps out.
She files lots of yarns.
She files so many yarns for news.com.au. Sam, thank you. Remember, Flash drivers, if you're loving the podcast, let us know. Subscribe and leave 5-star reviews. Tell your friends, tell your enemies. Everyone needs to be across the news of the week. Moving on now, and on the other side of the world, what a time it is to be a US politics watcher. And what a big week for Trump supporters and haters.
FBI has searched the home of former US President Donald Trump. Sources believe the investigation is tied to classified information that Trump allegedly took from the White House when he left office.
Earlier in the evening, he did accuse the FBI of raiding his house and even breaking into his safe, an unprecedented move that he called prosecutorial misconduct and a weaponization of the justice system.
We certainly know Donald Trump is mulling over very seriously another run for the White House. He's certainly already using this raid to fundraise and to rally his base.
What was on the warrant? What were you really doing? What were you looking for? Why not talk to President Trump and have him give the information you're after?
Okay, J-Law, let's start with a timeline first about what has gone on over the past few days, because this story, I don't think it's going anywhere, right?
No.
It'll be here for a while, and for American politics, especially pertinent in the next few months.
Yeah. And so what was really interesting about this is like nobody really knew it was happening and it just kind of quickly trickled out. And then, Donald Trump himself is the one who really announced that the FBI had shown up at Mar-a-Lago and were going through the place. Yeah. And they left with a bunch of different documents and boxes and all sorts of interesting documents that have varying degrees of classification, meaning they shouldn't have been there. And just to backtrack a little bit, what this is all about is that the FBI and the Justice Department has been trying to get a hold of these documents ever since he left the White House. And what's in dispute is whether he was upfront about having them and whether his people maybe didn't tell the truth to the FBI about what they still had.
And this comes off the back of earlier this year as well. Is it the National Archives? I may have forgotten what the official title is for that.
Well, it's the National Archives who is responsible for keeping all of these records.
Right. And so they had their own, with the cooperation of Donald Trump earlier this year, they had their own, what shall we say, reconnaissance mission or recovery mission trying to get back some boxes. And I think they got like 15 boxes of documents and took them back from Donald Trump, and they had them in his possession. What we mean by classified materials, well, allegedly and reportedly, these are some of them.
He wrote me beautiful letters, and they're great letters. We fell in love. But you know what? Now they'll say, Donald Trump said they fell in love. How horrible. How horrible is that? So unpresidential.
Yes, dear Flash drivers. That, for instance, allegedly love letters between the former president and North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un. I could just see, and this is complete speculation, but couldn't you just see like Donald Trump having people over and they're just like, hey, so how was it being president? And he's like, oh my God, do you want to see? Do you want to see some of the stuff I got? And it's just like, yeah, from Kim Jong. Here it is. Yeah, well, here are these missives.
Exactly. And he's famous for doing that. He uses these documents as a way to brag, really.
Yeah.
And that's always had, people in the security part of the government really alarmed, because he would do things like show off footage of people getting bombed and that kind of stuff. Yeah. And it's like all of that stuff is meant to be viewed in the most secure possible environments.
Need to know basis rather than a dinner date basis.
But it's classic Trump, right? Like he does not respect or ascribe to any of those conventions. And it's clear to me that when he took these documents, he truly believes that they belong to him.
Yeah.
The law says otherwise. The law says that they belong to the National Archives and they belong to the American people. And he shouldn't have had them.
Well, and this is the interesting thing as well, right? Because there is this obscure law, which we're not sure if it's going to have any impact right now, but it says that if someone's found guilty of essentially misappropriating these classified documents or destroying classified documents, that then they're not able to run for office within the American government or the White House once again, which would essentially and effectively rule out Donald Trump from putting his hat in the ring for another presidential race, which he said that he does plan to do. There's been an interesting focus, I think, of course, as we usually see on the partisan side of politics, over in America, whether it be Republican or Democrats, and how they have viewed this. Because really, in a lot of ways, this FBI raid, whether it's justified or not, the Republicans, it's given them kind of like this extra bit of oomph or mobilise them to kind of get behind Trump again.
It has. And it's pushed all of his potential rivals for the Republican nomination off the agenda.
I don't even know who they are.
Well, yeah, there's a few. So, and DeSantis is one of them who was kind of on the up, and now he's been pushed out of the headlines pretty quickly. And Trump has this way of sucking all of the attention towards him. So in some ways, I could see this being good for him. He's already sent out, a bunch of emails and texts to potential supporters and been able to fundraise a lot on the back of this, because it's the sort of thing that really does split everyone and kind of mobilize his base. So we'll see how the legal ramifications play out. But for now, I think it's been very good for his candidacy to try to win back the White House.
Well, let's talk about those legal ramifications in part because I want to focus on, there was an article this week from Greg Sheridan, who's the foreign editor at The Australian, and he said, unless it was overwhelmingly necessary, it was a shocking error of judgment at best, that being the raid by the FBI on Mar-a-Lago, which I think it was personally signed off by the US Attorney General in Merrick Garland.
That's right.
So that has then led to all of these theories going around about whether or not there's more to it than a few love letters between him and Kim Jong-un, and maybe there's alleged nuke details, et cetera, going on. Do you think that maybe this could backfire for the FBI and the Department of Justice?
Look, I don't think that they would have done this, and they, in fact, couldn't have done this unless they had a good justification for doing so. So the FBI can't just rock up and knock down doors and steal things from people's houses, right?
Yeah.
They've got to go to a judge. They have to have probable cause. So they've got to really clearly explain why they want to do this and why it's necessary and why really it's the last resort. They've done that, and they've got judges' permission to do so. And some of the reporting that's trickled out through the New York Times, Washington Post and others this week has shown that they were trying many other means to get these documents recovered for months on end, and either the Trump camp was either lying about still having these documents, or they were willfully obscuring their efforts to recover them. So in my view, I think the FBI has done the right thing. I don't know that they really want to charge Trump. I think that they just wanted to get the documents back because they do not belong to him. I still don't think he gets that.
I don't think so either. I think that he would go to the grave being like, well, they're mine though. They're my letters. They're the letters that I've exchanged or whatever they happen to be. It's like, well, no, I own them, right?
Yeah.
Can you see or foresee a time where Donald Trump is back in the White House?
I really can. So I think that he's yet to announce, but he's been very strongly hinting that he will. So I think that's possible. And Biden is on the nose with a lot of voters over there. I don't think he's been seen as being terribly impressive.
Unofficially 4,008 years old.
Right, he is quite old. So I don't think that Biden's in a very strong position himself. So Biden versus Trump, round 2, I think that he's a chance. So we'll see. And I think, like I say, this sort of raid on him, which he can spin into being some huge injustice, could really help mobilise his supporters once again.
Would America survive Donald Trump back in the White House?
Look, I'm sure they would.
Given how he left it.
Given how he left it. Look, I think that there would be a lot of effort to try to remind people about how reckless he was as a president. But they did it once.
Yeah, no.
They did it once. What's to stop them doing it again, especially if there is muted support for his opponent?
And you've been at Trump rallies before. You've covered them in previous roles. And I guess the fervency, I'm not sure if that's a word, but the fervency of his supporters, especially at those kind of events, it's a lot. He's able to, garner that support, that fascination, capture those headlines.
Yeah, and for people who in Australia who look at these headlines and, lots of people will be like, Trump's crazy, how could they vote him in? But it is sort of like you step into a parallel world where they really listen to Trump. They are uplifted by Trump. They feel like he speaks for them, and they kind of take in themselves all of his talking points. So you might, like any criticism you might, like I would say to them, I'd be like, what do you say to people who say this about Trump? And then they sort of have all the talking points, and they kind of know the responses, and they'll be like, oh, that's just the Washington swamp. And you're just like, they really buy, they buy what he says, hook, line and sinker, and he can do no wrong in their eyes.
I feel like I've only just exercised fake news from my brain always being shouted at me covering something, or it's just always there being like, fake news.
Right.
So if that was to happen again, oh God, I don't know. I don't know if I could do it.
Look, from over here, I'd be like, oh, it'll be an interesting time if he gets back in. Not great for the nation, but maybe good for headlines.
I mean, it would be. It would be.
It would be spicy.
J.Law, are you ready to feel ancient?
Well, I'm older than you as it is, so
more ancient,
even more ancient,
because I am bringing you and our listeners this vintage news report.
And what you've just been listening to is the ultimate in recorded sound. It will make all conventional disc and cassette systems obsolete. It's dustproof, scratch-proof, digitally recorded, read by a laser, and it's called the compact disc. But this is no ordinary disc, just 12 centimetres in diameter. The music is recorded onto it digitally, and there's no needle being dragged through a groove. That information is being read by a laser light.
7 major record companies have already signed up to produce on the system. With hardware and software both lined up, compact discs may well rule the roost, at least until someone perfects a method of putting Beethoven's Ninth on a silicon chip. Don't laugh. I'm assured that day, in fact, is not too far off.
Now, I've let that explanation go a little bit long there, just for any young'uns that we have listening to the podcast who have absolutely no idea what a compact disc is. But the CD has turned 40. That audio was from the old Beyond 2000 archive, if you remember
program.
that. Remember that program. J.Law, how disturbing is it for you that a great or a significant portion of our newsroom at Flash would have absolutely no idea what a compact disc is?
That is a worry. And what's worse, with this news that makes it even sadder, is that I wasted all of my disposable income on CDs.
Oh no!
I cannot bear to part with them. They're all in a box, and there's so many of them, hundreds and hundreds. And how much did they cost? $20-$30, depending on.
They were really expensive. Yeah.
And what was the point of all that?
I know. I think back to even just the amount of hours. I mean, there's still something nice about this, but the amount of hours that I would spend when you could burn your own CDs.
Oh, that was
and
cool.
You could make compilations of your favourite things. So it's like instead of So Fresh Summer 2004 vibes, you just had your own personal one.
Mm-hmm.
And I would put so much thought into that. And now I guess the equivalent is creating, a playlist and
Which is
sending
like
it to someone.
a few right clicks and it takes you 2 minutes.
Yeah. Like, I just don't think, and not to be that person, but like the youngins these days have no idea what we went through.
The youngins
these days. Like, what was your first CD? Do you remember?
What did I have? Come back to me on that.
I remember even
I got Neon Ballroom Silver Chair.
Oh.
That was a good one.
That's so you. Like, you're so indie and like so cool. That's your music taste. Mine was Britney Spears.
Oh yeah, that's cool too.
which was very, very cool. And I remember I would just play it over and over and over again because also at that point, like, there was no shuffle. Like, you could rewind to your favorite song or whatever, but it was still, usually you'd just be going through the whole deck. It wasn't like, track 1 and then, I've got track 14. Fun. Who knows what's next? It's like, I know what's next.
Did you have in your car like all of the burnt ones in the sleeves, and then you'd be don't do this at home, kids. You'd be driving and kind of like going through them and putting them in.
Yes, for sure. And I remember all through uni, it was Lana Del Rey was what I would have.
Cool.
And then I would have my burnt CDs from a girlfriend of mine in high school who I would say was just like very proficient in emo bands. And she would burn these ones for me based on like different like reading lists. So in those days, you would be like reading a book and then people on like Tumblr or whatever would be like, this is the album that I'd read it to and like all of this. And I would she would do those and give them to me. And it was actually really fun. So maybe the youngins these days don't actually know what they are missing out on.
Well, it's true. And like also it allowed you more to like listen to a whole album where like now nobody listens to an album, right?
Yeah.
It's like flicking between songs and
and I always think about that with artists who put so much time into creating the story of an album and then it's just like, nah, I like track 4.
Yeah.
That's the only one. On repeat. I'm just going to do that. What's this outro? It's not even any words in this bit.
Get it together, kids.
Yeah.
Get it together, kids. I mean, there's probably older people who are like, well, we did that with tapes or records and,
Oh, there was something that my partner was talking about the other day and it's like these mini discs. I don't even know what they're called. But he had like these even things and I was like, what are you even on about? But do you think that CDs could come back? Like, are people going to have, how trends come back or whatever? Are people just going to be walking around with Walkmans now with a CD strapped to their belt?
I don't see it.
I don't think it's very user-friendly.
No, they don't really have anything that's cool about them.
Yeah.
Like, I get why records are still cool because they're big and they're like tactile, but not CDs so much.
They didn't, when you think about it, because CDs have just turned 40. I remember, when they would have come into the world, they would have changed it instantly, but it didn't really take them too long to be completely obsolete.
No.
When you think about it. No offense, compact disc. Happy birthday.
Well, that's the thing about those mini discs as well. Like, they just were like 1 year, maybe.
Yeah.
And I remember that everyone laughed. There was a guy at school who like went all in on mini discs and he like got rid of all of his CDs and just like, I'm a mini disc guy. And he had like 6 months in the sun.
And also like CDs don't look very cool. So it's not like there's any aesthetic value to be like, oh, you could resell it now and like have it framed somewhere. Like,
and they get all they get all broken and kind of scratched and
So this made me feel very, very old, this milestone for the compact disc. What else? Is there anything else that kind of makes you feel old these days? And then also what makes you feel young?
Well, look, in our group chat at work, like some of the things that the younger people say and like we're like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Like our old producer, Beck, she used to write SK.
Yes.
And we were like, what does that mean?
I still don't know.
And then she sent us a link and then we looked at the video. It's like a meme comment and we still don't know.
It's been
She works at Punky now. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. It makes sense. Hi, Beck. It has actually been quite confronting for me because I've always been the young one. So to have our team at Flash who are all so talented and super young, it's been really eye-opening to be like, wow, I am essentially a boomer. And that's really unfortunate and not good for my own identity. And I'm also just thinking of, remember when we had in Flash's early days of Flash, and we went out for our Christmas party. This is like going back to the end of last year. And we had this big lunch and we're all sitting around, and I remember our producer, Alan, was down sitting with Beck and like all the youngins, and came back and was like, guys, I'm going to have to sit up here at this end of the table with you and I, because he's like, someone's talking about a Doja Cat. I don't know what it is.
No, he said Dojo Cat.
Dojo Cat.
Dojo Cat.
What's a Doja Cat? Alan's looking at us like, yeah.
He's fine. He's fine.
By the same token, though, what makes me feel young is any single time like I FaceTime my parents.
Oh.
Because one,
they keep you young, don't they?
Oh, they keep you young. My mum hates even just being on FaceTime. So I'll call them and I'll be like, because I, live interstate, I hardly see them. So it's like when I actually have that opportunity, the technology is available to see each other. And then I answer it and it's like a shot of the wall because mum's like, no, I'm not dressed, or I'm not looking good enough. I've not done my hair. I'm not coming on.
You're not on TV. It's not a live cross. Yeah.
I'm like literally, and I'm there like looking homeless on the couch, be like, hey, I'm like, Mum, it's just, and she's like, they're talking to me and I'm like looking at a wall. I was like, I may as well just call you back then.
I do find a video call sometimes confronting. I'm like, don't video call me. Like, no. So maybe that's my boomer ways as well.
Okay. But what makes you feel young?
Oh, I mean, again, talking to mum and dad, that's a good thing to do. Actually, texting my mum because she's only just now starting to text, and you can tell that it's taken her 20 minutes to craft it. And then I go straight back, yeah, cool, mum, emoji, blah, blah, blah. And then she like replies again in 15 minutes. And you're like, oh, mum.
Oh, with the correct pronunciation and everything.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes.
Full stops.
Does she sign off as mum? Because mine does.
Yes.
Mine goes, mum. And I'm like,
I know.
Mum, I know it's you.
Yeah.
Like, it's okay. You're
But that's
saved.
okay.
But that's fun.
But
That's
like
lovely.
she's onto it now. Like dad's not doing that.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
No. Dad, no. He's still there with the bloody smoke signals. My dad.
Actually, you know what my dad had? This is just like ragging on my parents now. My dad likes to tell the joke about, so he had one of those Nokia brick phones until like last year.
Oh.
And when Telstra had to call him and go, now, Mr. Law, we're turning off 2G. So we're just calling everyone who has a 2G phone, and we have to let you know that you've got to go to 3 or higher.
Oh, my God. Whereas, like, for us, I mean, Lord help Zoomers, they'd be like, what's a 2G? Like, what's that? Remember when it was like you were going, and I still remember when it was like the World Wide Web was becoming a thing, and you had to dial up the internet, like all that. They'd have absolutely no comprehension of that.
Yeah. I
Struggles.
remember when that first happened at school, and it was like you'd do the and then we're like, okay, we're on the internet now. It's like, oh, that it? Like, now what?
Because there was nothing interesting
there was nothing
there.
good on there. Now,
the world. Anyway, it all stemmed from the 40-year-old compact disc.
R.I.P.
R.I.P. May you never return. But what a fun 40 years.
What a waste of money.
What a waste of money. How much do you reckon your collection would be worth now? Like 2 cents?
2 cents. Yeah. Love hearing us analyse the biggest and smallest headlines each week? Make sure you follow us on the socials so you don't miss any content. We're on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and TikTok. Get on it.
J.Law, time of the pod. One of our favourite times of the pod.
Mm-hmm.
What can our listeners enjoy on the platform this week?
Yeah, well, this week it's all about House of the Dragon, the new Game of Thrones spin-off. So you and I...
I'll stop doing that in case we get copyrighted because obviously I sounded exactly like...
Remix.
An actual sample from the theme song. Yep.
We were lucky enough to go to the Australian premiere last night, right?
Yeah.
Now, we can't say anything because it's all top secret.
Top secret.
We'll just say, oh boy.
What a review.
That's my review.
Yeah, it was such a fun night. We can't talk about the first episode of the show, but you can watch it on Foxtel and start streaming on Binge from next week. It's
from
coming
Monday.
out from Monday, August the 22nd, House of the Dragon.
Same time as the US and the rest of the world.
Yeah, but we also do have some little bit of behind the scenes, red carpet glamour from that premiere with some of the stars of the show and top Australian celebrities. Some really fun. It was just fun to be there. So I think everyone was just having a great time and everyone was generous with their time. And there were Game of Thrones fans. There were some not so Game of Thrones fans. But it was just really, really nice to see everyone get behind this huge, huge program and have it be premiering in Australia, which
That's
is pretty cool.
Yeah, and so you can watch that on Flash now. We also have a bunch of other content previewing, what's going to be the biggest show of the year.
Yeah.
So you can sort of have interviews with all the cast members and little sneak previews that you won't get anywhere else. So that's all on Flash this week.
Including, not to age myself further because I know what CDs are, but Ryan Corp may or may not be having a chat with us, just saying, of Blue Water High fame, Sleepover Club fame, and also Silver Sun fame. So that was one of the bits that did age me and make me feel old this week.
You were fangirling, weren't you?
I was fangirling, and our producers had absolutely no idea, really, who he was. They knew him kind of from like Pack to the Rafters, but I said Blue Water High, and they were like, "What? Don't know what that is."
See, I kind of miss that because I'm too old for that show. So think about me.
Well, then I told Ryan, I said, "Ryan, I'm an OG fan. Loved you from the Blue Water High days." Spoiler. And he said, "Oh, way to age us." And I was like, "You just call me old. How dare? I will support the show, Ryan, but I am young. I am young." Anyway, before I go into my 38 existential crises of the week, remember, if you love listening to Flash Drive, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Just hit the bell button so you don't miss an episode. J.Law, we've nailed it once again.
We have. Thanks to Sam for all her insights.
Yes, that was
fascinating.
Incredible to talk to her. Watch this space. I just don't see it going away.
He won't go away.
No, you're right. He won't go away. The story won't go away. We won't go away. Well, we will for a little bit, but we'll see you next week.